You had a big town hall last night over the West Seattle Bridge. It seems like there is more and more momentum for a rapid replacement of that bridge. When do you think you'll make the call, make the suggestion along with SDOT on which route to go down?
We're hoping to make that, I'm hoping to announce that decision this week. And I think you saw from the town hall, and I got a binder from my task force of all their long and very thoughtful pieces. And not surprisingly, Seattle's actually split about down the middle in terms of repair versus replacement. And what we're going to be weighing are the same things we were weighing before, which is how much is it going to cost? How long will it last? And how quickly can we get on it? But then we also have to look at what will it do for us in the future. We know we have to build another bridge for Sound Transit, and that we need to be looking forward, not just one at a time, but thinking about how that whole transportation corridor is going to work for the city of Seattle. If we learned anything from this, we learned that we need more mobility, not less mobility to West Seattle. And to have a bridge that carries that many trips, 100,000 trips per day, go out. If we had not been in COVID with a stay-home order for most of this, it would have been even more impactful, and it's already really impacted those communities.
So you say an announcement this week. You don't want to make that announcement now?
I'm not going to make that announcement now. I've still got a few meetings with the final things with the engineers.
How do you pay for it? I mean, I know that one of the things that you had suggested is you weren't going to make that recommendation, that call, until after the election, that potentially could impact how you seek the funding.
So Chris, I think that that's a really good point. I think the fact that we have a new administration is going to help the city of Seattle on a whole range of issues. The transportation infrastructure dollars, though, are a little bit tricky. I was able to have a meeting last week with a handful of mayors to meet with the chair of the House Transportation and Housing Committee. And it is his best guess that they will not have a large infrastructure project until regular budget middle of next year, which changes our calculus some. So one of the things I'm looking at today and tomorrow is, number one, how sound is the engineering and the estimates on time thresholds for the replacement? Because we've seen it's a pretty ambitious schedule, and if that schedule slips, we could not restore mobility for 4 or 5 years. And I've heard loudly from people that the time is really of the essence. And at the same time, we want to know in the repair, really how long they think that bridge could last. They've estimated between 15 and 40 years. And so we know that we need to be planning for transportation in that corridor. One thing I really want to make clear to your listeners is I, like everyone else, would like to be smart about building this bridge. We saw that it was smart on I-90 to have space to add light rail. So I pushed very hard at the beginning of this to see whether there was any configuration in which we could add light rail to the bridge, either in replacement scenario or repair. And there is not. Partly that's because we don't know which of the alignments Sound Transit is going to have and how it approaches that bridge and what elevations, as well as what the load rating is for the bridge, that's not possible. So we will have a second bridge with Sound Transit, and I think we've got to be really smart and have some conversations about what that bridge looks like and how we can join with Sound Transit to make sure it ensures more mobility.
So to clarify, any sort of rapid rebuild would not include the Sound Transit portion.
That's right. Neither of these alternatives would include Sound Transit because it's not feasible. Not because we don't want to do it and not because we can't trade off car lanes for light rail. It really has to do with the configuration of the bridge and the approach and exit from the bridge, as well as the engineering and load bearing.
And to clarify another thing you said, the fact that there may not be federal funding until the second, third quarter of next year, that is going to be a huge factor in which way the city goes here.
It's an important factor because we know whatever timeline we're on, we need to restore mobility as quickly as possible. Now, we don't want to be foolish because this bridge will last for many years regardless of which alternative. But at the same time, if we can't secure funding, we obviously can't start demolishing the bridge. So we've got to look really carefully at that timetable and see what's realistic and what's not realistic and have some alternatives. And that's what I'm talking to SDOT and the engineers today. I'm talking to the governor. I've spoken with our congressional delegation because I know that we will need funding from the state and the federal government in either scenario.
So more money matters. The city budget, the council going through your budget. This is a crucial week in regards to all of that. There's been a fair amount written that it seems like you and the council appear to be on the same page with many of the issues. But is that the case? Do you feel like you've reached agreement on a lot of these things with the council?
I think we're much more in alignment than people expected. That we were fortunate, the council and myself, but mostly the taxpayers of Seattle, because we got additional revenues after I announced my budget. And so many people have cited to the $80 million differences between councils and my budget. Most of that is new revenue that we were able to forecast after I transmitted my budget. And I sent a letter to the council saying the things that I thought that they should fund with that revenues, and they did fund most of them. So I think that we are very much aligned. There's still some issues, obviously, that we want to make sure that I'm keeping my eye on. We have proposed some money for a Clean Cities initiative, so we can additional funding to really get us back to reopen when we're ready to reopen. So that means cleaning up a lot of the trash, debris, and other things that people have seen in every part of the city. We need to do that. We started the initiative. We're going neighborhood by neighborhood, but that's going to be important to fund. Obviously, policing is critical, not just in what the budget is, but that we have a vision for how we can move to alternatives to policing, but that we're thoughtful about it. Those alternatives are going to take some thought and time to build. So we will look at a couple of those issues, but so far right now, it seems like council is more in alignment with me than people expected.
So the Clean Cities initiative that you just discussed, is that going to do anything to address the fact that, and I know you've seen the complaints, that a lot of parks, public parks, have been overrun by encampments and debris?
So we've been, all these things are interrelated. Because council finally passed the proposal very similar to what we proposed in August on homelessness, we are going to be able to start engaging on some of those encampments in a much more intensive way. Now, obviously, council still has to pass the budget for next year, and that's going to be critical. We have to have the tools to engage with people in homeless encampments. We have to have shelter to bring them to. And as we know, once we do that, there still will be some encampments where people won't leave that present a public safety or health hazard that will have to be moved. And for the first time, council, the providers, and my office all agreed to those principles. And so I think that we will be able to make progress on all fronts.
What about the idea that parking is handed off to civilians?
I'm not sure what tell me what you're asking, sorry.
Parking enforcement, in terms of moving money around from the police department, the parking enforcement, a lot like 911 dispatch would be handled by civilians.
Yeah, the parking enforcement officers would remain the same functions and duties, although they probably would get some increased management of the roadway duties. I propose that they move to Seattle Department of Transportation because that's who manages all of our roads and rights of way. Council is looking at moving them to a separate department, but we would still have to have that connectivity. So I think that we can have a successful parking enforcement operation that doesn't need to be housed in a police department.
Gotcha. Okay. The issue at hand this week with the changes, you were part of the press conference on Sunday. I think a lot of people are concerned about restaurants and bars, especially in Seattle. Downtown Seattle Association already says 140 or so businesses have been shuttered since March because of the pandemic. Your office has tried to speed up the permitting process for a lot of these businesses to get tenting and sidewalks and heaters. I mean, is there anything more that can be done here in the days ahead?
This was just such a devastating blow for small businesses and particularly restaurants. And while the numbers show that we had to take some steps and the governor looked at that data, we know that right before the holidays, these workers and these small businesses are really suffering harsh blow. And I had an emergency meeting of my Small Business Advisory Council yesterday. I was joined by 3 city council members, and together we made clear that we in the city are going to do all we can to help our small businesses, in particular restaurants. And so that will include, we're trying to obtain additional funding on an emergency basis to provide some relief for those small businesses. Many of those restaurants just brought their workers back, just made all these changes to their internal settings, and to make it COVID free. And now they've got to close down. Those employees right before the holidays are out of work. So I've talked to the governor's office. They joined us on the call too. They have $50 million new dollars. We've asked that some of that money be transferred to City of Seattle so we can hand it out through the process we already have in place. We don't have time to set up new processes for everything. And we've got a very robust system that we were able to set up in March. So we want to get as much direct relief. We also are going to speed up permits to see what we can do for outdoor settings. We're looking at whether we can also help with some of the infrastructure for tenting and heaters and cut some of that red tape. This is usually the busiest time for retail and restaurants. And even during COVID, they were expecting a large part of their revenues to come now. So we in government need to do everything we can to help them through this.
Okay, since we're running out of time, I've got one other question for you. It's a fun one. Yesterday, your colleague down the street in the county administration building, Dow Constantine, announced he's running for re-election for a fourth term. You and I talked very early this year, pre-pandemic, about whether you might run for re-election. Any thoughts on what you're planning for 2021?
No further thoughts yet. I really want the presidential election to get certified. And my focus then is on making sure that as we move forward, having those new partners in the federal government, I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to put those relationships to work for the city of Seattle.
How will it be different with a different president after January 20th, knowing how much you've publicly sparred with the current president?
It will be very different at almost every level. And these last 3 years would have been very different for Seattle, but particularly this last year would not have been as hard if we had a different president. Not only did they not have a plan and were not prepared for COVID, but they undermined local jurisdictions at every step of the way. If you remember going back in time, it was almost like the Hunger Games where city, fighting state, just to get PPE for their nurses and doctors. We had to go to South Korea to get testing supplies. Against that backdrop, usually a federal government is there to help to provide national leadership. They didn't do that, but they also undercut us. The same is true for our civil rights reckoning. They should have convened at the national level a conversation and action items to come out of that. Instead, they sowed division. And if you look at the number of times we've had to sue the administration just to stop them from either cutting our funding that is our tax dollars or to stop them from doing things that are patently unconstitutional, I don't think there's ever been an administration that has fought its own people so hard.